Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth Ohio State University Department of History Ottoman and Turkish lecture. I'm Scott Levi, and I'm both department chair and a member of the field that is very happily hosting this lecture series, one that I hope will become a permanently endowed fixture in the department's intellectual life. The study of Ottoman and Turkish history has a very long and distinguished history at Ohio State. Professor Sidney Fisher introduced the teaching of Ottoman history to OSU already in 1935. And to put that in context, after more than 6 centuries of existence, the Ottoman Empire had come to an end only 13 years before Professor Fisher began teaching its history here. So I cannot claim that our program is the oldest in the country, but I can state with both confidence and pride that there are very few programs in Ottoman and Turkish history that can match ours in terms of graduate training, graduate placement, and overall scholarly contribution. With Yiğit Akın having recently joined us as the Finley Professor in Ottoman and Turkish history, our program is poised to remain an exceptionally strong center for Ottoman and Turkish history well into the future. Before we begin, there are a number of people that I'd like to thank. First, I'd like to recognize the many friends of the program who over the years have contributed to the endowment funds that support our students' language study and research abroad. And to all of you, your generosity is greatly appreciated. More specifically related to this lecture, I'd like to thank our emeritus colleague, Carter Finley, and his wife, Lucia, for their generous support, and also Mr. Sardar Tufekci, CEO of NG, and Ohio State Energy Partners for selecting our program as one worthy of support. So please join me in a virtual round of applause to recognize all of our benefactors. Thank you all very much. I'd also like to thank both Rhonda Maynard and Jane Hathaway for their considerable effort and attention to detail in making today's event possible. There is a substantial amount of work that goes on behind the scenes to bring together an event like this. And I am personally grateful to you both for everything that you've put into it. So let's give them a virtual round of applause too. So now, without any further delay, let me pass the mic over to my friend and colleague, Professor Jane Hathaway, who will introduce the speaker for today's lecture. Thank you. Well, friends, it seems the internet has suddenly dropped out at Jane Hathaway's neighborhood. So I'm afraid we have this really wonderful way to introduce our speaker, Professor Amy Singer today. And Jane can't get online. And she was going to email it to me, but she can't even do that because, of course, there's simply no email. Let me just say, it is a delight for us to welcome Professor Singer here today. And Professor Singer, I apologies for the fumbled introduction. Let me pass the mic over to you and we'll just get started.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. And even in her absence, I'd like to share my sympathies with Jane's predicament and also to empathize with her that we seem to live in a world where the connection only gets dropped for things that we perhaps really wanted to attend, and yet it remains robust for all meetings. So I'm sorry that she's not here yet, but I do hope that she'll join us soon. It's a pleasure to be here with you at the Ohio State University in Columbus, almost. And I am truly regretful that I'm not there in person. We had hoped that might work out, but at the time we took the decision, it didn't seem possible. My colleague Jane Hathaway, who invited me and who has spent an enormous amount of energy, even from what I can see, making sure that this would operate seamlessly, is in fact one of the most unflappable people I know and has an incomparable ability to concentrate in all manner of circumstances. And I'm sure that that's actually been a true gift to her students these past months and to her colleagues and that it's enabled her to pursue her exciting new research about the Ottoman Geniza, which I had the good fortune to hear about several weeks ago. I would also like to extend my thanks to Rhonda Maynard and Laura Seeger for their technical support, for making sure that this ran seamlessly with everything that was in their hands to control. The other people I'd like to thank are the students in my Capital Cities in History seminar this year who've been part of my insistent conversation around the question, what is a capital city? And they have been an enormous help in bringing together some of my thoughts on this subject. I'd also like to thank all of you for being here today, and to having patience at my attempts to pull together my thoughts around this question. I would like to say that in my Ottoman history course this semester, my students actually remarked, as they were preparing presentations about the authors that we're reading, they actually remarked on the presence of the Ohio State University among the biographies of these authors, either as having been students or being on the faculty, having been on the faculty. And they asked me of their own accord whether OSU wasn't some kind of Ottoman powerhouse. So I'd like to echo what Scott Levy said in introducing the lecture series. So it is truly a privilege to be here today to speak. I would like to say one more thing about COVID and the realities of the past long months. They have been truly trying and wearing on all of us. And I acknowledge the extra effort that you've spent in coming here today. I suspect that, like me and like many of our colleagues and students, we are close to, if not actually in full burnout. And I know that, so I appreciate your participation. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now and hope that this will work successfully. We should now be seeing my PowerPoint presentation. And if not, somebody will let me know somehow. Okay, so as many of you know, I've spent quite a long time in Edirne, getting there, staying there, and trying to understand what this city is about. It took me quite a long time to figure out what exactly I wanted to ask about the city, because I had initially gone there hoping to work on the array of public kitchens or imarets that were built in the first Ottoman centuries around the city. And when I tried to read some background about Edirne, Ottoman Edirne, I discovered that there really wasn't very much, and that was a perfect historian's distraction to investigate the city writ large. And after wandering around in Edirne's history for a while, I settled on the first half of the 15th century. In an attempt to think about what Edirne was as a central place in the empire before the conquest of Constantinople, with the thought that perhaps understanding that would also enhance the way we understand Istanbul itself and the constellation of Ottoman capitals altogether. Now, the period that I'm looking at, specifically 1402 to 1453, is one that encounters some major difficulties. The first is that, as with any other historical project, it's very difficult to understand something that's so remote in time without seeing everything else that happened in between the time I'm looking at and the time I inhabit. So this means actually peeling away all knowledge of what most of us understand about the Ottomans, and including the ultimate conquest of the city in 1453. It's a little bit like studying the reign of Abdulhamid II without knowing that there will be no sultanate at all within a half century. It's an act of willpower, not to look ahead. So I first was involved in a project of forget what you know. Now, that's harder than you might imagine, because the rest of the empire looms large in coherent, empirically grounded, and comprehensible narratives about the Ottomans that begin roughly from the middle of the 15th century, after the conquest of Constantinople, as the Ottomans deliberately rebuild and reinvent that city as their capital. Meanwhile, they're creating and bringing together an Ottoman identity and the increasingly credible dynastic claim to be world conquerors. It seems to me that it is the deliberate project of capital formation, in another use of that term from the usual fiscal context. It's this deliberate project of capital formation that distinguishes the shaping of Ottoman Istanbul from the Ottoman project in Bursa and Edirne. Now, in addition to forgetting about Ottoman history in the second half of the 15th century, we also need to forget what we understand about modern national capital cities, as well as imperial capitals of various eras. Because the Ottoman state in the early 15th century is not a nation state, and Edirne is not a modern national capital city, nor is the Ottoman enterprise an empire at this point. And while contemporary and earlier imperial capitals like Baghdad, Cairo, and Rome may become inspirational for the universally minded Ottomans following the conquest of Constantinople, this is not the case in this period. So the future, as it were, becomes a distraction. And yet the less we understand about a particular time and place, the thinner the empirical base for creating meaning becomes, and the more tempting it is actually to squint ahead. So general summaries of early Ottoman history recount that the Ottomans conquered the city of Bursa from the Byzantines in 1326, after which that city became the Ottoman capital. When the Ottomans conquered Edirne, Byzantine Adrianople, sometime around 1369, which is a disputed date, many authors give the impression that it succeeded Bursa as the Ottoman capital then. Almost a century later, in 1453, the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, but that city didn't actually begin to serve as the capital until several years later, when it had become more closely, when it become basically decked out and dressed in a more Ottoman costume in order to serve as the capital. So any straightforward sketch is actually misleading because it assumes that conquest and Ottoman and capital are all transparent concepts, and that the infant Ottoman state was just a diminutive version of its future self. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background. I'm not quite sure who the audience includes, so those of you who know this by heart will forgive me, and those of you who may need more will also forgive me. So over the course of the 14th century, the Ottomans gradually expanded the area under their control, in the process attracting increasing numbers of fighters who enjoyed a share in the booty and other benefits of becoming part of a local success story. And I'm going to share with you just a few maps to situate us. So this would be roughly what the empire looks like in 1402, the state, the Ottoman entity looks like in 1402, with this yellow line. And in 1413, after the defeat by Timur, it has shrunk to the orange sections. Edirne is circled in red in roughly the center of the screen. By the time, by the end of the period I'm talking about, the boundaries of the Ottoman territories will look something like this, with the farthest reaches in green signifying vassal states as opposed to areas that are directly under Ottoman control. And if we look now specifically at Edirne, this map will give you an idea with this large red dot off to the right center of where Edirne is located topographically in the Balkans, and you begin to get a sense of how strategically located it is at the gaps in the mountains and on the course of the Meric or Maritsa or Evros River. So if we draw on Linda Darling's effort to summarize what can be said about the 14th century, it seems that we can track the Ottomans in the first half of that century as they established the symbols and practices of sedentary rule and organization, including some basic endowment deeds and a taxation system. By the second half of the century, the endowment deeds were more elaborate and reflect an expanding bureaucracy and a greater financial capacity. The implementation of the Tamar system for managing land distribution to military commanders is in place, and the organization of specialized military forces and the use of foot soldiers in the newly formed Janissary or Yenicheri Corps will comprise the Ottoman military forces along with the cavalry and a variety of other corps. There's also evidence for the establishment of Muslim institutions, mosques, madrasas, and the employment of both foreign trained scholars and bureaucrats in the higher ranks of the new administration, as well as some locally trained clerks and teachers who are the first graduates of the new madrasas in the Ottoman realm. Money to fund these initiatives came from nascent taxation systems, as well as the ongoing military successes of the Ottoman sultans and their followers, who translated some share of their booty into stone monuments as tangible evidence of their victories. However, in 1402, the Ottoman story ended almost before it began, with Bayezid I's decisive defeat at Ankara by Timur-Lenk or Tamerlane. Now, this initial defeat was followed by the further westward incursion of Timur's troops, including the sacking of Bursa, which was not only the Ottoman capital, but a major commercial and manufacturing town that had been the urban anchor for the Ottomans since the time of its conquest in 1326. Timur left all but one of Bayezid's sons free to compete for leadership over the fragmentary remains of the Ottoman enterprise, thereby ensuring a period of Ottoman instability. Yet the Ottoman recovery rate in the early 15th century suggests that the princes, in particular Mehmed, were able to draw on the groundwork previously laid. Nascent versions of what became classical, quote unquote, institutions were restored and developed by Sultans Mehmed I, Murat II, and their administrators. They reconstituted the various military corps and expanded the institutions of provincial governance, tax collection, and revenue management, even as they recovered and expanded Ottoman territory. Now, because this story is at this point equally Ottoman and Byzantine, we need to look at the Byzantines for a moment. And in this same period, as the Ottomans are expanding their territory and systematizing their administrative forms and personnel, putting their first marks on the landscapes of Anatolia and the Balkans, the Byzantines were confronting multiplying challenges with shrinking resources and limited success. Adrianople had been the third largest city in the European territories of Byzantium after Constantinople and Thessaloniki. The city was occupied by the Latins in the first half of the 13th century during the Fourth Crusade, a locally contested occupation that brought a certain amount of disruption and harm to the city. In the years 1280 to 1330, while the Byzantines gradually lost control of West Asia Minor to the Turkish Beys, Thrace and Macedonia remained the base of their shrinking state. Recent research is gradually adding to our understanding of the climatic impact of severe weather events, but these seem to be only one part of the story, which includes the damage inflicted on these same regions by the marauding Catalan mercenaries, whose own chronicler, Ramon Muntaner, bragged of how thoroughly his company had devastated the resources of the region. The Byzantine civil wars of 1341 to 1354 further destabilized Thrace, as it became one venue for the political rivals who made Adrianople and Didymoteichon their respective seats as they challenged the emperor in Constantinople. Now, these difficulties were compounded by the Serbian conquests of the 1340s in Macedonia and Thrace, And finally, by the first outbreak of plague in Constantinople in 1347, a sign that the century of the Black Death had begun. This is why my students almost try to leave Ottoman history in the first and second classes because it seems so desperately confusing. Now, even as Thrace remained under Byzantine rule after the Civil War, local realities had shifted significantly. Turkish warriors from one beylik or another had been invited to participate on each side during the Civil War, giving them an opportunity to cross the Dardanelles and learn the geography and topography of the region while getting a close look at Byzantine fortifications and fighting strength. So when an earthquake provided the opportunity, Orhan, the second Ottoman Sultan's son, Suleiman, seized the fortress of Gallipoli in 1354 to establish a permanent Ottoman base on the European shore. From there, he and his followers raided northward, capturing Byzantine towns one by one. The more fortified coastal towns held out much longer against the Ottomans, favored by their easy access to the sea from which they could resupply as well as import reinforcements. The constant presence of Ottoman forces, however, disrupted cultivation in Thrace, undermining the local economy as well as the steady supply of foodstuffs to Constantinople. By around 1380, that is after the conquest of Edirne, the Byzantine hinterland in Thrace had shrunk to a small space close to Constantinople. The Ottoman challenge to Byzantine rule paused briefly after 1402, but then retrieved its momentum. The uncertain security situation induced many to leave Constantinople, fleeing to Europe or joining the Ottomans. Byzantine unification, so-called, with Rome in 1439 added yet another element of domestic discontent for what was increasingly a city-state. So this is a summary picture of the two sides. Now, since we usually see Edirne first through the haze of early Ottoman uncertainties, I'd like to introduce it now with some of its more enduring features. And we can take a look at this slide, which is an early 20th century map of the city, which allows us to see certain physical features. The city sits actually on a low hill, about 75 meters high, which overlooks the plain that stretches eastward, some 230 kilometers towards Istanbul, commanding the gap in the Istranca, Balkan, and Rhodope Mountains, some 30 to 50 kilometers to the north, northwest, and south. Edirne was originally the Thracian settlement of Uskudama before being conquered by the Greeks to become Orestiah. Under the Romans, it was renamed Hadrianopolis for the Emperor Hadrian, who developed it to become a more substantial fortified urban center, adding a walled perimeter measuring roughly 800 by 600 meters and enclosing about 48 hectares. And if you look at this map, you can see the rough outlines of this rectangle almost directly in the center of the screen, just to the right of the flow of this river, which bends in a C shape around the west side of the city. As Byzantine Adrianople and Ottoman Edirne, the city was a key defensive node guarding the western approaches to Constantinople, and otherwise a political, religious, commercial, and military hub. It sat on the Via Militaris, or the Orta Col, which was the main overland route from Constantinople to Sofia and Belgrade. And it also sat on the secondary branch of the Via Egnatia, which actually passed to the south of it, which was the paved Roman road stretching between Constantinople and Rome. Now, along with its strategic location and gentle terrain, Edirne enjoys the benefits of three major rivers, which you can see on this map. The Tunja flows from Bulgaria in the north, creating a large floodplain as it bends around the western side of the city to meet the much larger Maric, or Maritsa, or Evros River. The Maric continues south to the Aegean Sea, where it empties at the city of Ainos, Greek Ainos or Turkish Enes. The third river is the Arda, which you can see coming in from the left side of your map, from this just to the south of the Maritsa, which flows east out of the Rhodope Mountains to join the Meric. Over many centuries, these rivers have sustained agriculture, including grain and viniculture, pastoral farming, and small industries, and provided transportation, allowing Edirne at different times to become a prosperous trade hub and a lush and fertile urban center. The city has profited from human and commercial movement on this river, as well as overland between the Balkans and Constantinople. Now, until the 19th century, the Meric was actually navigable above Edirne as far as Plovdiv or Filibe or Philippopolis, down to the Aegean. It thus served commerce and communications deeper into the Balkans, as well as south to Dimetoka, which is about 50 kilometers south of Edirne. In this way, it could provide an alternate escape route if needed in moments of political or social unrest or outbreaks of plague. To the southeast, Edirne was also linked overland to the port of Rodosto or Tekirdağ on the Sea of Marmara. So all these advantages also made the city a target, notably among the Byzantines, the Crusaders, and the Bulgars in the late 12th and 13th century, who were all competing to control the Meric Valley. Now, the Ottoman conquest of Adrianople has been dated to various years between 1359 and the 1370s, with the most persuasive being, I think, 1369. But it's not at all clear that the city wasn't conquered more than once. The narrative summaries of the conquest of the city sometimes make out as though the Ottoman capital at that point transferred from Bursa in Anatolia to Thrace, but this was not the case. It seems much more likely that the capital functions actually moved to Edirne only gradually in the early 14th century. The later Ottoman chronicles give the impression that in the late 14th century, sultans and beys came and went from Edirne, but no one seemed to stay there for any length of time or to do anything of note. It may also have been the place where Balkan booty, including captured people, was shared out on return from campaign before the troops dispersed for the winter after the campaigning system. The city that the Ottomans conquered apparently existed entirely within the Roman walled perimeter. Under Sultan Murad I, the Ottomans are reported to have transformed the churches there into mosques, while leaving the residents in place and unharmed because the city surrendered as opposed to being conquered. Ottoman Muslim civilian settlement, on the other hand, seems to have been entirely outside the walled perimeter. Of this, we know almost nothing in the 14th century. Now, Murad I supposedly built a palace at the highest point in the city, about 600 meters away from the walls to the north. And this map being in German, you can locate this space by looking north of the walled rectangle to what is labeled Neuer Sarai in the kind of open white space just north of the walls. However, the Selimiye Mosque and neighboring buildings have covered the city for almost, have covered this area of the city for almost 5 centuries. And so we don't really have any physical evidence of the palace as such, except maybe for a small hammam. There are 2 descriptions from the 1430s that refer to the palace in use as a reception hall, including a narrative of the ceremonial for receiving a diplomatic envoy there. But they offer no insights into additional aspects of the palace. Ashik Pashazadeh, writing in the late 15th century, describes the death of Sultan Mehmed I in Edirne in 1421 and an elaborate staging of his live appearance until the arrival of his son to take the throne. And a similar ruse was mounted when his son Murat II died. Now, Ashok Pasha says that these events took place in the palace, but doesn't give us any further details. So we have no certainty that there was, in fact, a palace in the 15th century. The first dynastic monument in Edirne that we can identify, and that's described also by Ashok Pasha is the Mosque of Yildirim Beyazit, which is on the map that you can see, spelled with a J, not a Y, to the west of the Tunja River, which is the one that curves around the city like a sea. Now, this mosque was founded either on the ruins or on the presence of a monastery church in what was a village called Aina, which was across from the old walled city, as you can see. Bayezid also built a bridge or reinforced an existing bridge to get to this mosque out there. But this is over a mile from the city center, which is quite some distance from the walls and the markets that crowded the city's northeast edge. So one question that does not yet have a satisfactory answer is why the first sultanic monument should have been in this location. Why built so far away from the city itself? Which leads to the question, who was the mosque serving? Was it the people who were in Edirne, the Muslims in Edirne? Was it possibly the soldiers encamped on the outskirts of the town as they mustered to leave on campaign? One might argue that it's as much about removing a Christian building from the landscape and using existing structures to establish a monumental Muslim presence in a settled district of Edirne's environs. After the defeat of Sultan Bayezid I by Timur-Lenk, so that is after the founding of this mosque, his son Suleiman is said to have escaped from Bursa to Edirne, taking the Ottoman treasury with him, which is one of the first indications we have that the Ottomans were looking for some kind of central establishment on this side. And while the sons of Bayezid competed for control of state, they successively contributed to the building of a large Friday mosque in Edirne, which is much closer to the walls of the city. And I will show you a photo of that in just a moment. So this Ulu Jami, or Eski Jami as it's now called, was built on the eastern city wall along with a market as part of an endowment to sustain the mosque and its functionaries. Both of these were built with booty from the conquests that have been renewed. Now, the city enjoyed increasing security through the 15th century as the dynasty stabilized further under Murat II, and the Ottoman frontier moved steadily northward and east and westward, effectively ending the centuries-long era of arrest and disruption around in Eastern Thrace. Ottoman conquests in the Balkans also created a continuous flow of cash and booty, including captives to be sold in Edirne's slave market. The central commercial zone expanded from the eastern edge of the walled city as a thriving hub of manufacturing and trade. Individual rulers and high-ranking officials also added smaller mosques, madrasas, baths, and fountains to Edirne's cityscape during these years, reinforcing the monumental project of the Sultan, probably the most intensive period of physical development for Edirne in all of Ottoman history. Murat II, let me now find images for these. So, right, okay. So this gives you an image of the Eski Jami, which is the mosque on the left behind this large Han building. And Murat then adds 3 monumental Muslim institutions, a Sufi lodge for the Mevlevi dervishes, which is essentially behind us in this photo and quite some distance. He built a school for the study of hadiths, a Dar al-Hadith, which is quite far in the distance on the left back section of your screen in front of the river, which you can see in the distance. And he built this imperial mosque, the Uch Sharaf Ali, which has 4 minarets, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. And together, these three institutions infused the city's perimeter with the sights and sounds of Muslim faith and learning. Toward the end of his reign, Murad began to develop a new palace, moving down from the hill, if there was a first palace, above the walled city to a broad plain across the Tunja River, north of the city. His son and the sultans who succeeded him maintained and expanded this complex of buildings, eventually occupying an area comparable to that of Topkapı Palace. So let me now try and give you some visual impressions of these monuments. Oops. So this is the Eski Cami, the old mosque. And here you can see it from a different direction. What I'd like you to notice is these photos are in this third quarter of the 20th century. And what you can see is that the city perimeter actually ends quite quickly. And then you have this vast unsettled expanse. This is something that seems to have been characteristic of Edirne for quite some time, both before and afterwards. Here we have an early 19th century image of the palace. If you look at the right-hand side, you can see the exterior palace wall and the view back toward the city. So you have an impression of just how far away this palace was from the city. And the greenery, that is the trees that you can see between the palace and the capital and the buildings in the distance, is that floodplain of the river as it bends around the city, which was entirely unsettled by the Ottomans. It was left as a floodplain then, as it is mostly today. This is a view from the city then looking back toward the palace, which you see in the distance on the left. And again, you get a good impression of just how big this floodplain is, and then how unsettled the spaces are, pretty much at just beyond the edge of settlement in Edirne. This is a photo from sometime around 1870 when the Russian-Georgian photographer Dmitry Ermakov visited Edirne. Okay, and this gives you a sense of Murat's buildings and the way they're laid out around the city itself. The large light blue triangle is the location of apparently the first palace, if it existed, and the large dark blue triangle is where the suburban palace was built after that. Okay, so these are just some impressions of the city. Now, almost 50 years after the Ottoman state of Bayezid I was shattered by the defeat by Timur, the revived Ottoman endeavor had surpassed its former strength. It defeated a Catholic coalition at Varna in 1444, and then was able to breach the walls of the much reduced Byzantine Constantinople in 1453. Both of these campaigns were launched from Edirne, which continued as the anchor of Ottoman administration and court life for some years more, while Mehmed directed the rebuilding and repopulation of Istanbul. In the meantime, Edirne hosted the circumcision celebrations for Mehmed's sons in 1457 with elaborate feasts and public entertainments. And Edirne continues for quite a long time after that as a seasonal imperial residence, a mustering ground, a cultural center with many madrasas, and quite a prestigious appointment for qadis and teachers alike, and an alternate stage for diplomatic and dynastic ceremonial. So it thus retained a premier status among Ottoman cities, often serving as the winter quarters of the sultans throughout the second half, through the second half of the 17th century, when it was the permanent residence, and functioned as a second Ottoman center of gravity for some time after that, until the Sultan and the court gradually returned to Istanbul on a more permanent basis. So what this summary leaves me with is questions about how actually the Ottoman capital comes into being, whether in Bursa, Edirne, or Istanbul. I'd like to plant another thought in your head. with these few slides, which are based on the article by Abdullah Quran about the spatial layout of these three Ottoman cities. Now, he describes their spatial transformation from Byzantine to Ottoman cities. And he notes that this took place in the framework of the conventional Turkish urban organization of castle, city, and suburb, with the castle holding a central position and the bazaar close to it, while new Ottoman neighborhoods grew up around mosque complexes. And so this is a schematic map of Bursa with the mosque complexes of different sultans pointed out on it. They stretch from to the west and to the east of the citadel, forming part of the urban hubs. The picture in Edirne is different because the terrain is different. Whoops. I have lost my Edirne map. I'm so sorry. But essentially, the Ottomans spread from around that square perimeter of the Roman city to form a series of complexes that encompass the old city walls. And what is different, notably, is what happens in Constantinople. Now, this is a late 15th century map, apparently, of the city after it's been conquered. But what we can see is that the city is largely empty in its center, and the Ottomans undertake any number of foundations inside the city. And this is distinctly different from what happened in Bursa and Edirne, where the Ottoman foundations happen outside. And one of the things that I'd like to sort of plant as a thought in your minds is to what extent the complexes in Bursa and Edirne were intentionally serving as the anchors of new neighborhoods, or whether that's what they became as the city developed. If we look at these complexes as they're being formed and ask who would have been using them, it's true that there is a gradually growing civilian population, but at least, but in both cases, it is the army which is a significant part of the population, incidentally, as it forms and then disbands several times, in the spring and then in the fall. And so I wonder to what extent the settlement around these complexes didn't follow somewhat later, and whether the complexes might not have been serving Ottoman allies as they gathered. Now, I know that that's a stretch because these are large complexes, but I do wonder whether we're not overly anchored, as it were, in this notion that these are the hubs of urban development, which is what they certainly became, but I'm not sure that they entirely started out this way. Okay. Now, in thinking about these cities as capitals, however, my point of departure is the simple characterization of Edirne as the second capital of the empire. And from there, I'd like to ask what an Ottoman capital was anyway in the beginning of the Second Ottoman century, in the 50 years leading up to the conquest of Constantinople. And what happens to our understanding of things as we then shift our perspective to ask about capitals. So looking at the Ottomans, it turns out that multiple locations served capital functions collectively or individually, and that there was not a single fixed urban capital until the conquest of Constantinople, and indeed not even after the conquest of the city. And let me explain briefly why. It is the case that during the time that Bursa is the capital of the empire, as we see it, the Sultan spends relatively little time there, which means that the functions of government, which were largely close by the Sultan at any one time are moving with him and not located in the city. So the city may have ceremonial functions, it may be the residence of the Sultan's harem, but it isn't necessarily the locus of government. The locus of government may well have been the Sultan's tent for a good part of the year as he went on campaign. And then even after he returns to Edirne, it seems to be the case, as when he returns to Bursa, it seems to be the case that he spent a great deal of time traveling around, checking up on the parts of the Ottoman entity which had been conquered, and ensuring that they remained in good order. When the Ottomans conquer Edirne, it isn't the case that the capital moves to Edirne. Many of what are capital functions remain in Bursa for several decades, and it's only gradually that we see Edirne beginning to assume some of these, that is, as the location for celebrations, and even as the residence of the Sultan in the winter. Meanwhile, the Sultans spend quite a lot of time still campaigning, almost annually. And as they're campaigning, they are moving the seat of government with them. So neither in Bursa nor in Edirne, but out somewhere with the army. So it seems that there is no notion of one unique sedentary capital for quite some time, and that the Ottomans essentially buy into the notion of a single sedentary capital with the conquest of Constantinople, which they are obliged to do by the existence of the walls and by the legacy of the Byzantine capital, which they are assuming as they expand their own idea of who they are and what their goals are and what the nature of Ottoman rule is about, so that they have universalist aspirations and then adopt the capital vision of the empire that preceded them in this city. And even so, what we gradually learn by looking at later sources is that they continue to go to Edirne seasonally and spend several months in the winter for long periods on an annual basis, and that they aren't rooted entirely in the city of Istanbul, and that even when they return to Istanbul as a center in the beginning of the 18th century permanently, after having spent many decades in Edirne, that they move around the city of Istanbul a great deal, until gradually in the 19th century, it seems that they become more and more permanently resident in the Yildiz Palace under Abdulhamid. So I think that when we ask what was an Ottoman capital, and recognize that it actually was a constellation of places and spaces which offered unique functionality to the Ottomans, whether it was as command centers, locations of governance, locations of ceremonial, a home for the harem, a safeguarded place for the treasury, as was the hilltop town of Didimotikon or Dimetoka for a long time. We can see that this may reflect, in fact, the only very gradually cohering notions of state and state formation that this enterprise entertained of its own self. So I hope that I've given you some food for thought about what an Ottoman capital might have been, and that you can now perhaps travel back to those early times, having peeled off some of the accretions of later centuries. I have to just close in saying that there has been very little discussion of what Ottoman capitals were. And there has been there's really been no substantial work until quite recently on Edirne. But I'd like to point out the publication quite recently of this book by Suna Chabtai, which is called The First Ottoman Capital of the Ottoman Empire. And she tries to attack this question of what is an Ottoman capital for Bursa. But we have somewhat different agendas because she's much more carefully looking at architecture and building over the course of time in Bursa, whereas I'm trying to ignore everything that happened in Edirne after the conquest of Constantinople, in order to get back to whatever this city was about before its place was challenged by a competitor with whom it could not compete. So thank you very much. I was very glad to see Jane Hathaway has rejoined us. And I will, in closing, acknowledge her efforts and the kindness of her invitation to speak to you today. Now, I think I'm going to turn the mic back to you, Jane.
Yes, thank you, Amy, and I hope you can all hear me finally. I was at home, and the minute we went to the webinar, my internet completely crashed. So while Amy was talking, I drove to campus with Scott Levi holding while on the phone with Scott Levi so that I could continue to listen. So I'm sorry for that. It's one of those things. I am here to moderate the questions and answers. I would like to say a few words of backwards introduction to Amy, just because I was unable to give the introduction I had originally planned because my internet crashed. As most of you, I think, know, she is the Sylvia K. Hassenfeld Chair in Islamic Studies and also the Director of Graduate Studies at Brandeis University in the History Department. This was a position she took up in 2018 after spending nearly 30 years as a faculty member in the Department of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University, where she helped build the important Ottoman history program there. I want to make sure I give a sense of the range of her coverage in Ottoman history. She has done far more than just Edirne. She started out working on rural life in Ottoman Palestine in the 16th century, which led to her first book, Palestinian Peasants and Ottoman Officials, Rural Administration Around 16th Century Jerusalem in 1994. And she then turned to the enormous charitable foundation established by Hurrem Sultan, the wife of Kanuni Suleiman, or Suleiman the Magnificent, in Jerusalem. This led to her second book, Constructing Ottoman Beneficence, an Imperial Soup Kitchen in Jerusalem, from SUNY Press in 2002, and in turn to a much broader investigation of Islamic charitable foundations generally, which resulted in her 2008 book, Charity in Islamic Societies, published with Cambridge. During these same years, she also spearheaded a number of important collaborative projects on the subject of charity in Islamic societies generally, which produced several edited and co-edited volumes and special editions of journals, including the journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, of which she is immediate past president. So I just wanted to note all of that so you can see how widely she has covered the Ottoman waterfront while also going in depth and having total command of all these different subjects. Edirne is simply her latest project. So with that said, the floor is open for questions and answers. And what I would encourage you to do is to write your questions in the Q&A box that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. It is also possible to raise your hand, and I think I saw one hand raised, but I'm not sure it's still raised. Marion Robinson had her hand raised. Are you still here? Would you like to ask a question? Hearing nothing, I'll go ahead and ask a question myself to the extent I can, since I was in my car for much of the lecture. And even though I was listening, and I'm still seeing a raised hand. Oh, Carter Findlay. Please go ahead.
I'd like to pursue a little bit more a question that I took up privately with Amy a while back. Some of the sources talk about how the court moved back to Istanbul in 1703 after, in some cases, it says 50 years of residence in Edirne. And I asked her, since I had not found earlier mentions of when the court moved to Edirne, I asked her about this, and she said, well, in some sense, they had never left. I wonder if there's more bone structure that can be put on this thing about a protracted period of residence in Edirne in the 17th century. In some ways, it reminds me of what was happening in the Habsburg Empire, if I'm not totally off base. I think it was about the same time that Emperor Rudolph sort of like moved to Prague and wanted to just stay there. And so I wonder if there's maybe some kind of underground connection to things that have to do with the ecological crises of the 17th century, or maybe some other factors like that. I'm sorry, this sounds kind of vague and diffuse, but it's. I would appreciate if she could say anything more about that.
Okay. Greetings, Carter. It's nice to hear from you. So I think I've been thinking about this some more as I've been teaching Ottoman history this semester, and I think that you're probably right to ask to connect the question to ecological, what we know to be the ecological difficulties and challenges of this period, but also it seems that there's a particular conjunction of events in Istanbul, I guess right after, soon after Köprülü becomes the Grand Vizier, when there's a very large fire in 1660, which Mark Baer has discussed extensively, that had been, I think, preceded by an earlier fire not too long before that. And in general, and then was followed by disease and plague, and in general, making the city quite an unpleasant place to be. It seems to also be the case that Mehmed, the young Mehmed IV, has already earned himself a reputation as somebody who likes to have a good time, isn't particularly interested in the more serious aspects of his position. And that all may contribute to having the court then remain for extended periods in Edirne. But where you and I started this conversation with my initial response was that it is clear from even just reading through various chronicles, just trying to scrape out data about, okay, when do the Ottomans move? When is the Sultan where, according to anyone? That the Ottomans repeatedly go to Edirne in the winter, and then stay there for a few months. Now, this is something that seems to be quite an old habit, spending the winter in Edirne. And it may have to do with this being the off season, during which the Sultan is goes hunting, in part to continue to keep his immediate sort of core of loyal, his inner circle in fighting trim through the winter. It also may have an ecological argument at its outset, which I've been puzzling over in the text of that is attributed to someone named Hakim Bashir Chalabi, which is quite a curious text. I translated just a bit of it in the new publication. It just arrived. This is called The Ottoman World. It was edited by Hakan Karateke and Helge Anatofer. It's just out from the University of California Press, and this is a compendium of translations. So for all of those who look for source material to teach with, you can use that. In any case, so Hakim Bashir Chalabi writes that he had a conversation with the young Mehmed, the young Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror, on the banks of the Tunja, sitting in Edirne, and other than portraying himself as a close chum of the empire of the Sultan, he stages a conversation about Edirne's environment, in which he describes its climate and its rivers. And he remarks that it is a good place to spend the winter, which is a kind of curious remark. And it got me asking the question, well, what do the Ottomans do in the winter? Because I suddenly realized that most of what we narrate about Ottoman history in its early centuries is about the summer, when we have them campaigning here and there. But if we take this remark seriously for a minute, that Edirne is a nice place to spend the winter, I wonder if that isn't some sort of clue as to the congenial environment of Edirne. And then as a comparative statement with the environment in Constantinople or Istanbul, but because the text is thin on comparative material, it's impossible to say. But I do think that because we can, to some extent, document the repeated presence of the Sultan and the court in Edirne year after year in the winter, that it isn't so surprising that in other moments of discomfort, they would have stayed there for quite some time. It also seems that the palace was kept in relatively good repair for quite some time, with repairs and additions of various small buildings. And we know that the palace was extant until the 1877-78 war, the Russo-Ottoman War, at which point it is set on fire, apparently, by the retreating Ottomans, and then blows up because it's become a munitions depot. So we can, the archaeologists have done some surface surveys, and they can identify the built structure underground, and there have been some virtual reconstructions of the palace. There's also a great deal of photographic evidence for it. So it does seem that it would have been a nice place. It's definitely a suburban palace. It's close to the hunting ground. It's very green. It's very lush. So it isn't surprising that they would have spent time there, and that wouldn't have necessarily been a very happy situation for instance, the merchants of Istanbul.
Well, winter is axiomatically hunting season, and the idea of the Sultan needing to keep his male entourage in fighting trim makes a lot of sense. And of course, in Mehmet IV, you have
other questions. Can I just ask you to?
Okay, sure.
We can continue this some other time, but Carter, I would I would put some chronology into that, and just remind us that Mehmed IV is much less of a warrior sultan than some of his predecessors, and so his immediate coterie is in fighting trim makes sense in the early 15th and maybe early 16th century. It starts to make less sense, and I think Tulay Artan has done extensive work talking about the hunt as the gradual, almost ceremonial replacement for the Sultan departing on campaigns by the early 17th century. So there are lots of things to sort of parse out in this, but I'm going to go back to Jane, who can see questions coming in and maybe wants to get into this herself.
Yeah, we have a comment and a question. I'll take the comment first. It's from Grigor Boykov. We were just talking about before the webinar started. Thanks for the truly fascinating talk. A tiny note on the photos of Ermakov, which you showed. Based on Russian consular reports, we can date them a bit more precisely to June and July of 1875. Okay, the question is from Aram Gill, and you're going to like it, I think. He says, Ertugrul, the drama series, and Osman, the related series, have brought Turkish culture and the origins of the Ottoman Empire to international interest. And we might add, of course, Magnificent Century. What are your opinions about these series, if any? Sorry that this question is not about Edirne in particular, but I could add, you could take the two Fatih, Dizileri, Fatih and the more recent Mehmed Bir Cihan Fatihi. And since we know that Fatih Mehmed actually spent most of his time in Edirne, if you watch those two series or one of them, how did they portray Edirne?
Okay, so I have to say I am not entirely caught up on my DZ watching, but I did actually make a note when I was watching Magnificent Century that the first time that Edirne really shows up in the series, it's I think it's I noted this actually, it's like episode 18 or something of the full-length episodes, and it's basically let's go away for the weekend. because the whole setting is, you don't really see much of the outside, but the whole setting is portrayed as though the residence is in the middle of a kind of a huge garden, and I think there's a bird in a bird cage that's part of the whole thing, but it's an extremely pastoral setting in comparison with the mood of the Topkapi Palace. And I thought that that was very interesting, just as a kind of modern interpretation of what one would find in Edirne and why the Sultan would have gone there. I have to confess that I don't remember how much I finished of Muhteşem Yüzyıl, but it's one of those things I dream of retrieving. So I think though that I use bits and pieces of these various series when I teach, because in making some of them, the film crews had access to spaces that it's very hard to communicate to students, particularly if you can't take students to Istanbul or to other places. And so I think that the series have been very valuable for communicating some of the physicality and space that was available, even with what we could say is, oh, it wasn't quite like that, and those two things don't actually physically connect, but still giving us a sense of the stone and the size of rooms. I think the series have been really valuable for that. They are also valuable for teaching history because they're useful as conversation starters. So I sometimes assign something to my students and then say, okay, what kind of history is this? For what purpose is it being narrated? Who's the anticipated audience? What have the creators chosen to emphasize or not? And then it's actually pretty easy to segue from that into talking about sources and asking the similar kinds of questions of primary sources as a way of sort of demonstrating to students the extent to which you need to interrogate the construction of any text, whether it's a visual text, a video text, or a written text, but that you actually have to interrogate the text as you consume it in whatever fashion. So I have found them to be very useful. I don't want to discourage my students from being enthusiastic Ottoman series watchers, but I want them to remember what it is they're watching and why.
Well, speaking of sources, we have a comment from Gunhan Barekci, another Ohio State alum, pointing out that the State Archives of Dubrovnik contain some diplomatic sources that apparently provide critical information about Edirne, the Second Palace, and court ceremonies under Murad II. I'm assuming you haven't yet worked in Dubrovnik, so I will just present that as a comment, something for the future. Another question from Betul Kaya. With Edirne surrendering and Constantinople being conquered by force, do you think the way in which these two cities were taken by the Ottomans makes any difference in the development of either urban center and their subsequent expansion?
Interesting question. Before I forget, I want to thank both Grigor and Gunhan for the comments, and I've noted them down. So to Betul Kaya's question, I think it always makes a difference if a place is conquered by force or surrenders, because it affects what happens to the local population. And I think that we can't take the people out of this. In terms of what happens spatially, what to me is striking is that the Ottomans seem to ignore the walled city. We have no evidence for this, but based on what they build afterwards, it seems that they weren't interested in the walled city, and were more concerned to build things on their own once they were interested in Edirne at all as a living space. And I think that may be one of the distinctions. So that as some kind of a permanent or semi-permanent living space, Bursa really is still a kind of anchor. I think that more than I had recognized, the conquest of Constantinople creates for the Ottomans a series of obligations which they cannot avoid. So having conquered the city, they have to invest in it, and they have to dress it in an appropriate fashion, which I think is why they don't move there immediately. There needed to be a palace, there needed to be some kind of residence. And then we see that Mehmed has a building program that he parcels out among his viziers and other people. But in a sense, it's what we understand when we read about the kind of argument between the people who thought Constantinople should be conquered and the people who didn't think it should be conquered. And perhaps they were not only objecting to the forces that were driving towards the conquest, but maybe had a sense of how much obligation the conquest of this city was going to create for the Ottomans, inescapably. For one thing, they were going to have to keep the walls repaired. They were going to have to build significant monuments inside the city to put their mark on it, and not just take over the Hagia Sophia and make it a mosque, but work very hard to create symbols and structures that shouted out the Ottomans are now here and are now in control. And it's a large project. It was a very expensive project. It also, perhaps more than other things, obliged them to create a navy, which was a very expensive project. So if you look at it in that sense, I think that they may not have had a full picture of what they were signing on for. That being said, it wasn't only Mehmed's project to conquer Constantinople. The Ottomans had been aiming at that for decades before, including under Bayezid I. So it's clear that they have a sense that this should be the destination. I'm just not sure that they were fully cognizant of what it was going to entail to be there. So it's rather like, taking a big job and discovering that you have to, re-outfit your wardrobe so that you can look like the person who now inhabits this new position. But think of, the city as being the thing that needs to be dressed.
Other questions? Yi, did you have a question? Your hand was raised earlier. Okay, hearing nothing. Let me ask, and you may have addressed this, Amy, while I was frantically driving down here, trying to listen at the same time. What is the current state of the excavations? And when I Google Edirne and the palace, I get these strange images of a fully reconstructed palace that's open for visitors. Is that just some kind of pipe dream, or is it actually happening?
Okay, so I have to say that I haven't been to Edirne in much too long, as you might have guessed. It's one of the sadder parts of my life right now that I haven't been in Turkey very recently. I have heard rumors of all kinds of plans for Edirne over the years. It is true that I don't know what the state of excavations is right now. There had been excavations that uncovered the palace kitchens, and the kitchens were then reconstructed. They uncovered a bath, and the bath was then reconstructed. There was a virtual reconstruction of the palace that included the chief archaeologist at the time, Mustafa Özer, walking through the palace, which was quite dramatic, with appropriately dramatic music accompanying it. And I think that that was done maybe by Ter Bir. I had heard that there was a plan to create a recreation island in the middle of the Tunja, somewhere in the vicinity of the İkinci Beyazıt complex. So over in the same area. And I had heard discussions about whether the excavations would or would not continue of the major palace grounds, with the following observations that I heard. One was that, in fact, the surface surveys that we can now do with ground penetrating radar and such can give us a fair sense that the foundations of what we see are what we can see in photographic evidence. There were queries about the cost of doing it. On the other hand, there were also, in fact, I had heard that there had been discussions about reconstructing the wall and then perhaps reconstructing more of the palace. But I never learned any of the details of that. And I have no idea whether that was actually realized. So I do know that there are numerous small excavations going on around the city of many much smaller buildings, which give us a picture of the initial building periods, which I think in many ways are more interesting because they begin to show us the size of buildings that were built in the early 15th century. So that's not a very definitive answer for you, but it is the case that some of these mosques have been restored. There was a great deal of restoration that went on earlier in the Beyazıt complex. There was a lot of restoration work done at the Üç Şerefeli. The madrasas outside the Üç Şerefeli, one had been restored and another was slated for restoration. So it wouldn't surprise me that there is a restoration program in progress.
Okay, any additional questions? I'll ask another one if not, and then I'll allow Amy to take some well-deserved rest. Oh, here's one from Yiğit. How does Edirne compare with Bursa in terms of the functions they fulfilled as capitals? This is my colleague Yiğit Akın from Ohio State.
Thank you, Yiğit. So I think the most obvious one that numerous people have pointed out is that there are no sultans buried in Edirne. Even Mehmed I and Murat II, who ruled from the city, were buried in Bursa, and Fatih is buried in Istanbul, as we all know. So there are only a very few minor princes and princesses who were buried in the Dar al-Hadith complex, and otherwise there are no imperial tombs. The tomb of the young Prince Mehmed, soon to be Mehmed II, but the tomb of the young Prince Mehmed's wife, Siti Sultan, who was a Zulqadar princess. Her tomb is in Edirne. It's in the yard of her mosque there. And as far as we know, she never left Edirne for Istanbul once that city was conquered. People have all kinds of things that they've imagined about not a very happy relationship and all the rest of it. I think that the easiest way to sort of comment on that is that it was a political marriage, and understanding, as we do from Leslie Pierce's work, that marriage would not have had any offspring. And so Siti Sultan would not have really had any reason then to travel to Istanbul if she preferred to stay in Edirne. So that's a major difference between Istanbul and Bursa. And Bursa remains a place where people visited as a kind of pilgrimage to these sultans' tombs. As far as I understand, Bursa was not a place of extended imperial residence. Again, after the court really leaves Bursa and Edirne and moves to Istanbul. I think people traveled through it, but I don't think that it is a seasonal residence in the way that Edirne continues to be. I could be mistaken on that, but I've never seen anything to indicate that. So that's another difference. I think that Edirne continues to be an army camp, and I'm not sure that Bursa does. Again, I think that once the anchor is Istanbul, that campaigns leaving eastward muster on the east side of the Bosphorus and then leave, and they may go through Bursa, they may stop there, but Edirne seems to remain a mustering ground for a longer period after the conquest of Constantinople. I think that the two cities have very different vibes. It's not a very scientific term, but they're really very different physically. And so I think that in and of itself would have created different kinds of experiences. I can see Bursa being a nice place to go in the summer. Frankly, I'm not sure how much skiing the Sultans did. So it may be that it was a place to travel to in the summer, and that's certainly a big difference between those places. Because there was a large palace in Edirne, it continued to claim imperial investments, although more residential than anything else. Yeah, that's the list that occurs to me off the top of my head.
Okay, well, before we close, I had actually planned a much longer introduction had my internet meltdown not intervened, but I just want to close with a little personal note at the risk of embarrassing Amy. Amy got her PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton in 1989, and she was a few years ahead of me at Princeton. So during my first year, she was already off doing her dissertation research in Istanbul and Jerusalem. And people kept telling me, you have to meet Amy Singer, you have to meet Amy Singer. So finally, at the end of my first year, it was May of 1987, I remember this, I went up to Brandeis
Right.
to attend a conference on Jews in the Ottoman Empire. It was one of the first academic conferences I ever attended. And I believe you gave a paper, or if you didn't, you should have. But that was where I met you. It was definitely worth the wait. And in my mind, you've come full circle by returning to Brandeis, almost as if it were fated.
I actually share that memory. I did not give a paper. I was back in the States because it was Ramadan and I couldn't do the research that I was doing in the Muslim court because it was closed for most of the month. So I came back and I had the opportunity to attend that conference and meet all kinds of people that I'd been hearing about for ages. And yes, when I came back to Brandeis, I actually thought about that as well. So I share that memory. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Again, my apologies for the internet malfunction. Sometimes the internet gods do not smile on me. But yes, I hope you'll join me in thanking Professor Singer for this really innovative and enlightening talk. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure and privilege to have you, if only virtually, next time in person.
Thanks,
And
Jane.
thank you to the audience for your questions and your attendance.